welcome back. It's been a good day so far. We have one more excellent panel for you where we're going to get into topics of architecture and urban design and doing that in a socially equitable and with social justice in mind, put it that way. But before we do that, this is our 8th year doing this now. A lot of good ideas over the past 8 years, and a lot of good projects have actually come out of this. And none of this would happen without the generous and sustained support of the Kendeda Fund. Nuñez, where are you? Stand up, take a bow. Receive our adulation, please. We thank you. It's been wonderful, and we appreciate it, and we have a special, well, I don't know, tribute? 2 minutes of love headed your way, so enjoy. So thank you. Thank you. And your assignment is to go home tonight and binge watch all of that. You'll be so much smarter, trust me. All right, let's talk about redesigning communities in a more equitable way, in a greener way, an important topic. Our next speaker works with small businesses, community leaders, and residents to build economic power in New York and the Bronx. We won't mention the world champion Red Sox in his presence. Oh, I guess I just did. So sorry about that. His commitment to radical economic transformation is evident. He organized young people around the issues of sustainable economic development, education, reform, and voter education. Please welcome Yorman Nuñez.
And will this? Perfect, great. All right, y'all. Hello again, I'm Yorman. I'm the director of the Just Urban Economies program at MIT CoLab. In that capacity, I help advance the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative in the Bronx, which is what I'll be talking about today. And shout out to Grist. All right. So what is the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative? And before I go like deeper into the model and the idea surrounding it and stuff like that, let me just tell you a little bit about the Bronx. So the Bronx is, and I guess I could go to here. Yeah, the Bronx is huge. It's 1.5 million people. If it was a city in the United States, it'd be the 7th largest city in the country. And if you grew up in the Bronx or live in the Bronx, chances are you're poor. It's the poorest urban county in the United States. Chances are you're obese. We have the highest rate of obesity in New York. Chances are you have asthma, highest rate of asthma. Chances are you're living in dilapidated housing, right? Your landlord is trying to kick you out or has been, ignoring the building altogether and letting it fall in disrepair. And a host of other things. So the Bronx is often characterized for all those negative statistics, negative trends. But at the same time, while all that is true, chances are you'll be near the world's largest food distribution center, the Hunts Point Terminal Market. It's a distribution point for 48 states, 55, foreign countries. The Hunts Point Terminal Market is in zip code 10474, and there's barely even like enough supermarkets in zip code 10474. Also, at the same time, you'll probably be around like a large hospital or a university or a large what we call anchor institution. So even though you're probably broke, you're on your way to work or on your way to school or walking through the neighborhood, you're sort of walking by a massive institution, right? Or chances are you'll be around like one of the city's largest commercial corridors. We have a few. Fordham Road, for example, is the New York City's third largest commercial corridor. It gets as much foot traffic as like Herald Square, in the city where the big Macy's is. So all those things we call hopeful contradictions. And I just wanted to make sure I provided that. And I'll talk more about hopeful contradictions because this is sort of what helped start the initiative, this perspective, this way of looking at the borough, was what helped develop the energy and the vision that became the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative. But BCDI was really started by grassroots organizations, community organizers that have been organizing in the Bronx for a long time, particularly around issues of equitable economic development. And they had a self-critique. So they sat together, I should say, we all sat together, and we started saying, what's up with the way we're doing organizing, right? Because if you put our organizing strength on a graph, vertically, let's say, over time, you can argue we've been getting stronger and stronger. We're joining larger and larger coalitions. We're coordinating more with social media. We're contacting our members a lot more regularly, a lot more rapidly. We're doing trainings a lot more effectively, a lot more frequently. Every year, we're putting out annual reports that are showing, we're winning all these policy fights, we're winning all these victories over and over and over again. And if you take our organizations for that same amount of time and looked at the residents that are in our catchment area, they've been getting poorer and poorer. So there's a disconnect between our victories and our folks owning and controlling the assets that are driving the policy changes we're fighting in the first place. And at that point, we basically asked ourselves the question, how can we shift our organizing so that we could position our folks to own and govern the economy, essentially, right? What would it look like if we owned it? What would it look like if we ran it? What would it look like if we built it? What would it look like if we planned it, right? From there, we started to take seriously, all right, let's do that. Let's shift our organizing. How do we proactively build that capacity? So we decided that we need to do an analysis, right? We need to do a study. Let's look at all the assets in the Bronx because we generally had that attitude, what I described before, right? We always get characterized for our negative statistics, but we saw all these amazing things that we would always tout, that we would always, project, that was central to our organizing. So what we wanted to do was study that more. So we built a partnership, and there's a whole story behind that, with MIT, MIT CoLab, shout out to CoLab, who we basically decided let's analyze the whole Bronx and do a development study. So that's online, you can look at it. It looks at the borough's assets, their potential for shared wealth creation, which was central to what we wanted to do as well, how we envisioned a different economy for the borough. And it outlines short-term, medium-term, and long-term projects for it. And that sort of helped the stakeholders that were involved in this process think critically about what could be, look at assets that we didn't even realize we had right in the borough, and just create a lot more room and space in the planning and the designing of what should our economy, our local economy be. We also did, and this was really hard to do initially. We also did what we call we built our economic democracy training series. So as we're sitting together, you can imagine I'm in a room with a bunch of senior organizers and directors, and we're like, all right, we're gonna do this. And then someone's like, yeah, but if really we're gonna have our members lead on this work, they gotta be trained. They gotta be trained on this. Who knows what economic democracy is? No one knows what economic democracy is. We gotta do deep capacity building, deep training, deep education. So Yorman, go make a tool, go make a toolkit, come back, and then we'll train our staff, our leaders, all that kind of stuff. So that's what we did. We made a 500-page curriculum. It's also online. You can go to colab.mit.edu. It's open source. You can use it for whatever you like. It details 10 modules, and it breaks down exactly, if you wanted to facilitate, how to facilitate down to each section, what sentences you can say. So we did those two things. We did training and we did our analysis, and that led to us going, all right, now what are we gonna advance in the borough? And this is a picture of exactly how that was. So this was just one of the retreats, and the way we went about it was we took the Bronx's foundational challenges that we want to address. We put them on one side. We also mapped out in the middle, and that's not what that picture is. I'll tell you what that picture is in a second. But we put in the middle sort of what exists to address those challenges, and we obviously weren't satisfied with what was in the middle column. And then in the right, we said what should exist, what could be developed that could partner with what exists, and then address those things and build an economy that builds shared wealth and collective ownership for folks at scale in the borough. And what happened was the pieces that that are left to build, we said our role as a community, our role as a group, is to build those things, build those missing, what we call economic infrastructure. So then we took that and put that on the wall and said, all right, green, what are the, yarn? Yeah, yarn, there you go. Green yarn represents money, blue yarn represents ideas, red yarn, represents people. Let's actually map out how will these even work together, and let's actually map out how this will behave and exist in our communities to be powerful and to be able to allow us to be able to make big moves in the economy and position local residents to have a lot more ownership and a lot more governance over planning and economic decisions that happen in the Bronx. And that picture is a result of that. As you see, it looks like a circuit board, but we've since then have simplified it a bit. So this is, as a result of that, this basically became our model. What we decided to do was we want to build 6 discrete economic infrastructure pieces that are interrelated, that coordinate very deeply, with one another, that in many ways can't even fulfill its own purpose fully without being in deep coordination, with one another, that are community-owned and focus on building economic democracy in the Bronx. And those 6 pieces are, the first, we're building an economic democracy learning center. And the point of the economic democracy learning center is to really build the curriculum and the programming for like formal education and informal education to help folks develop a framework for how to even shift their economy and learn how to get involved. So you can look up the curriculum. We have 10 modules. It's across a bunch of stuff. But the key thing is here we do programming and we do workshops with community residents. We also do it with anchor institution representatives. We also do it with elected officials. We do a lot of folks, and I can explain why we decided to do that. We also are building a policy and planning lab. So the idea here is, what is the long-term plan for the Bronx? What are people saying the Bronx's future is? How are people looking at the Bronx's competitive advantage? If you read a lot of stuff formally by the city and state, the Bronx, its competitive advantage or some of its assets, people essentially are saying it's cheap labor force, right? It's cheap labor. A lot of folks willing to work, travel to Manhattan, travel to Brooklyn, and do stuff, and we got to help, and invest in the Bronx to be able to effectively do that. That's why it's really easy to if you're in the North Bronx, you can get to Manhattan 30 minutes. But if you want to see a family member in the West or in the East, it'll take you an hour plus, to go around. There's no investment in, community there. It's all like back and forth. But anyway, so how do we position our folks to build that long-term plan for the Bronx and engage in those planning processes? So in that capacity, we do quite a few things that I'll talk about later. We also decided to build something called the Bronx Exchange. So speaking of hopeful contradictions, one of the things we saw was we looked at the top 22 anchor institutions in the Bronx. Collectively, they spend $9 billion on goods and services a year. Where's that money going, right? So we started thinking, how could we capture that and reinvest it in things and drive it down towards things that build shared wealth and collective governance at scale in the borough? Let's build the Bronx Exchange. The Bronx Exchange is a social enterprise that connects large institutional purchasers and small businesses in the Bronx, and it does it in various ways. It's outlined there. But the idea there is, how can we build a competitive advantage for entrepreneurs, for small businesses that are committed to building community wealth and are committed to building economic democracy? That's the idea. And also, folks were really behind this idea too, because we want to advance revenue generating models. We want to not just be dependent on private foundations or government contracts. We want to build things that generate revenue that can reinvest back into the network and help support stuff. We love you, Diane. We love Kendeda, right? But we're trying to enact a self-sustaining, sustainable model. We're also trying to build the Bronx Innovation Factory. So the idea here is, how could we change how we make things in the borough? How can we prepare people to even make things in the borough? How could we create a sector that intimately connects skills, manufacturing and politics, right? Economic democracy and planning, innovation skills, all those kinds of things. And this originally came, right, because we're thinking, we started mapping out stuff, and then we was like, hey, if we're planning to take over the economy, we got to be able to make stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like, we have to be able to do that. Just at a basics, we have to control like what that is. And that thinking, helped start the initial thoughts for the Bronx Innovation Factory. So we're building fabrication facilities, and right now it's in its pilot stage, and we run cool 3D printing, CNC, the stuff you were talking about for young folks and entrepreneurs in the Bronx. And this is just a quick thing of, we have Shuri, a big poster of her like in the Innovation Factory, and that's basically what we want to do, right? For anyone that's seen Black Panther, that's what we're trying to build, and we're gonna do it in the Bronx. And it's no coincidence that what do they do, the X, you know what I'm saying, Bronx. So we take that very seriously, and said it's our responsibility, right, to build this infrastructure piece for the people and for the culture. And we're also trying to build the Bronx Fund, all right? The idea here is what's the sort of financial asset, what's the financial infrastructure we can build that'll keep funding and resourcing this type of work and leverage the huge assets that we have in the Bronx. So the idea here is that this would be like an endowment plus a business acquisition, a real estate acquisition fund plus a business development fund, and that's the vision. And this is still in its conceptual stages, but we're prototyping how we want to build this actually through the Bronx Exchange. We're building capacity to lend to small businesses and are learning sort of what it takes to do that, and figuring out how we can get to building something like the Bronx Fund. And then finally, a civic action hub. And the idea here is all our community-based organizations, there's a lot of CBOs in the Bronx. Throw a rock, hit a CBO, And some of us coordinate, not all of us, and we all for the most part, work in silos. What's the thing we can build that'll sort of connect all of us and allow us to do, coordinate at such a higher level to do much stronger and more strategic policy and political sort of moves in the borough. So all those things together is what we call our community enterprise network. And what we hope to do is make the community enterprise network the foundation of economic democracy in the Bronx. So all those pieces, we're building those. The first 4 I presented, they're like in different stages of advancement. But in some ways you can say, all right, you're building those pieces. What are you actually doing though? Like what are the kinds of moves you're able to make in the economy? And before I talk to that, there's one slight contribution we'd like to make on our thinking on like what scale is. So also a lot of what drove the design behind those specific infrastructure pieces and in that model is our thinking about scale. And a lot of the time, the first time we were thinking about scale was because a foundation sort of said, are you thinking about scale? And it was like, scale, okay. What does scale mean? No one knows what scale means, right? It's different for everybody. But we started thinking about what it means for us, and I do think that's important for folks to decide, right, what scale means and defines that. A lot of the times, folks describe scale as you got a model, you got a project, make that 10 or 100 times bigger. That's scale. You've achieved scale. And as community organizers that really get frustrated with non-comprehensive approaches to addressing problems, right? We started thinking like, no, scale is more about diversity than big. Scale is more about, do you have the capacity to tackle the problem at all sides to address root causes? So that kind of thinking as well is what drive the ideas behind the Community Enterprise Network. And to us, we're 4 out of the 6 pieces are up and running in some form. When we get to 6, all 6, and they're all working together, that's our idea of like we've achieved scale. Now we're gonna focus on having a larger impact and being more sustainable and all that kind of stuff. But we've achieved scale, and I'll describe why a bit more why in a second. But what are the moves? What are the type of moves we're making in the economy? The pick. Okay, this. I think this isn't the most up-to-date slide, but I'll leave it right here. So, for example, in the Bronx, we have a huge displacement pressure going on. A lot of folks are, a lot of landlords, a lot of different rezonings are happening that are driving up property values, that are, that are making it easy for a landlord to harass you and kick you out. And it's been happening all throughout the city, Harlem, Brooklyn, Queens. I mean, I'm sure everyone here is aware. And the Bronx is sort of the last frontier, right? And one of the things, because we have a policy and planning lab that works with the Bronx Exchange, right? That works with our Economic Democracy Learning Center. One of the things we have been able to do is work with community-based organizations, values-aligned developers, values-aligned finance, to do planning for the Bronx on how, comprehensive planning for the whole borough on how to stop displacement, which is starting to become really effective, because a lot of the times folks either to curb displacement, they think at the neighborhood level or the citywide level. And we're thinking at the borough-wide level, and that has given us a lot of tools, helped us generate a lot of tools to stop displacement and do fight back and fight forward strategies. Fight back meaning, a landlord is starting to raise rent. Well, a fight back strategy is, all right, we're gonna start organizing tenant associations there. But what we're also doing is fight forward strategies. We have this mapping tool that I was hoping to show y'all that allows folks to see, all right, what are the drivers of displacement? We're seeing that this neighborhood is getting hot, or this neighborhood's blue and is starting to turn hot. What are the things we can do proactively to stop it from being a bastion of gentrification? And are we going to acquire lands? Are we going to acquire parcels? Are we going to put them in community land trusts, et cetera, et cetera? So this type of planning happens on a monthly basis. And the education work, the planning work, and the working with small businesses work is we're able to do that kind of borough-wide planning because of the pieces that we've developed. Some of the other things that we've been able to do, for example, is we have been able to take elected officials of color at the city and state level in the Bronx to learn more about economic democracy and understand how successful examples in the Bronx and throughout the world how can we learn and adapt lessons from those experiences and apply them in New York City. So this is actually some of the elected officials. There's 13 elected officials. This is them in Mondragon. We took them to Mondragon to learn about the cooperative ecosystem that has been built there. And what that has led to is a historic hearing that's happening November 20th. Actually, not too far off from now. There's never been a joint city and state hearing in the history of New York, as far as we can tell, and as far as they can tell. So they're organizing, they're sponsoring the first one, and it's going to be focused on economic democracy. And the hearing question is, how can we build an economy that works for New Yorkers of color? And they're going to hear different stakeholders talk about their ideas, talk about assets that exist in New York City to scale up those ideas, and talk about transformative partnerships. And at the end of this hearing, one of the processes we're going to start is that each borough that shows up, we're going to say, do your own planning process in your borough for how you would build economic democracy. And then let's do this event the same again next year. Come back with your plans, and let's have a different conversation, right, with government. That's more like resources plan, and and jump off and start the like organic community, ground up planning process for building economic democracy that these electeds of color could support. So economicdemocracy.nyc if you want to learn more about the event. And we're asking folks to submit testimony digitally as well. So you could do a quick video on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter with the hashtag NY for economic democracy. We're gonna capture everything that's populated there and submit that to the governor as well. So I'll stop there with I wanted to end off with some questions like, what are the hopeful contradictions in your place, right? Because theirs is where we see opportunity for folks to lead transformative economic development. How are you investing in local leadership of color? And if you and your community did your own like design process for the economic infrastructure you wanted to build, what would it look like? Are you working on that? Is your work, prepares you to do that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Continue on this theme. Our next speaker has spent 2 decades of effort trying to make American cities more democratic through art and design. He's created a nonprofit called the Center for Urban Pedagogy, which aims to demystify policy, improve civic engagement in cities, especially among young people and marginalized groups. Please welcome Damon Rich.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon. All right, still there, fantastic. It is really excellent to be with a group of people who care a lot about how we tell stories in public, because right now I'd like to start by talking about before, after, and beyond. So probably more than a press release or a mailed flyer or even a speech by the mayor, here's one way that I like people to learn about some new urban design projects in their town.
Around the clock, this is News 12 New Jersey.
Well, you may have heard about a plan to spruce up the Passaic River area in Newark.
But the dreaming goes far beyond cleaning up a blighted area. As News 12 New Jersey's Rick Holmes shows us, the new vision could bring hundreds of jobs and even several new building projects to the Brick City.
So you started this back in October, you guys? Wow.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm seeing all this trash out here. You weren't cleaning up the trash?
No. It wasn't our job.
It's a mess out here. The work began with a group of Newark teens who wanted to learn more about their hometown river. Do you have to walk the river?
You have to walk around the
Yeah. You had to walk, see what was down here, really like get up close and personal with it.
Their work has paid off. Newark City Hall wants to turn the Newark riverfront into a brand.
It's a little fast and loose with the facts, but opposed to the classic boosterish before and after, which dramatizes the transformative powers of design, for me, this story of curious kids looking around like the Bloodhound Gang, where we learn by following their steps, seems to have a better chance to slip into while expanding people's everyday experience of the world and sense of how it gets shaped. So it's their interviews and investigations, discovering all kinds of things like dead birds and boxer shorts, to their own city's long tradition of fighting for environmental justice that drives the design process, beginning with visions of shoreline roller coasters and chocolate-smelling smokestacks, leading to a public unveiling and a city hall installation right outside where you pay for your water bill, drawing passersby into its intense vision, and then calling into being new institutions and powers of collectivity for physically shaping the environment, creating screens for projecting desires, spaces for self-determination, unexpected objects like an orange boardwalk grown from this particular culture, and new ways for the city to see itself, As you walk along, the railing tells stories about fights over sewer infrastructure and dioxin contamination. There's these logs that talk about conflicts over land and labor disputes, summoning up the characters and the spirits of this place, trying to connect it to its surroundings through new civic rituals, giving spaces for the threads of culture to tangle in new ways and bring everybody you can to the dance floor, breathing in the cool darkness and commemorating the light. So when somebody walks by and asks, hey, who put that there? There is a cosmos full of answers, including activists who worked for 25 years and some curious kids. So once we had gotten that far, maybe then people might be curious to know a little bit more of the details that it took to stitch this new piece into reality. Maybe the funding or the politics, or hell, even the landscape architects and urban designers who were involved. Now, this sense of collective contestation in changing the environment was not how I experienced where I lived for my first 18 years in the far west post-war suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri. Even as that environment beckoned my friends and I to get curfew tickets for trespassing over country club grounds or 7-Eleven parking lots, I thought of that landscape as neutral, as somehow just having happened, not as a project of planning and design. And while there I experienced many advantages, I also acquired some serious sanctioned ignorance about how the suburb where I grew up came to be. For example, how it became so segregated with over 93% of residents registering as white on the census. And how did all these people become white? So while different than the fast violence of a shooting on our minds or a stabbing, this kind of slow violence is written into our landscapes in all kinds of overbearing and also subtle ways. And design often serves as a way to cover over what's really happening, to be power evasive. Now, I think that words like equity, inclusion, and participation can be really useful to build shared understandings about where we want to go. But unless we're paying careful attention to the forces that shape the systems that we're trying to change, we run real risks of our work being short-term and easily undone. So while it's important to talk about who is marginalized, we better also be talking and learning about who and how they do the marginalizing. And so this is what my partner Jay Shin and I had in mind when we named our practice Hector, which is our imaginary friend's name, but also a verb, meaning to speak forcefully, even to the point of bullying, because we wanted to never forget that whether we like it or not, design and planning aren't always about warm, comfortable feelings. These are hectoring businesses. So I'm not going to try to convince you that architecture is something brought down by flying babies from the heavens to give us dignity or comfort, or a goodie bestowed from on high by professionals like me, sort of like a magical pixie dust, generously sprinkled down, doing its best to avoid political dilution on its way to reality. And instead, at Hector, we see our work like when you show up at a party not knowing anyone and are happy for any temporary alliance you might find, which puts our work in a broader field of place politics, where all kinds of people are trying to push all kinds of agendas on the places that we share. And that maybe by paying close attention to place politics, we can avoid creativity serving as a power-evasive cover story, and instead use it to generate and support productive deliberation about how we plan, design, and build. Now, telling these stories requires critical attention to the agendas and the nuts and bolts that push and pull the landscape, including the many conflicts between the prerogatives of property ownership and the ideals of democratic decision-making. And over the past 120 years, our society has developed some pretty intricate mechanisms for trying to connect democracy to how we build our environment, from building codes and zoning laws to things like community design centers. And these have created the mechanisms that today we call things like public participation or civic engagement. Although sometimes, even 120 years into the game, you can go to a so-called public hearing and not see much public there. Or maybe you go to a meeting that seems solely focused on the understandable aggravation of residents facing overly scripted planning exercises. You better not get out those Post-it notes and sticky dots. But usually, this kind of breakdown is not just in the meeting itself, but must be understood as part of a longer chain of democratic control. Often the idea of democratizing by giving things out or increasing access gets a lot of gusto, but the challenge of resolving all of those people through an act of abstraction and decision-making, and then getting into the building the power to do anything, let alone planning, designing, and building with all of the large and tiny questions that it poses. So while discussing participation, we also need to talk about power and how it is assembled and used, like many of my fellow speakers have today. Maybe we don't need responsible design so much as a serious reworking of to whom design responds. So now I'd like to suggest a few ways that design in modest ways might help us deal with power more openly and in a more manipulable fashion, before, after, and beyond. And to bring this a bit down to the ground and maybe put a little muscle on these bones, I'd like to share some work in progress, very much so, that Hector is doing in Southeast Philadelphia, that we certainly hope fits squarely within this tradition of community design. So this is a park, you can see that green square in Southeast Philadelphia called Mifflin Square. If you know Philly, this is near the intersection of 6th and Rittner. There's about 40 blocks surrounding the park where you'll find about 17,000 people living in row house homes like this, shopping on the Ave, which since the 80s has been primarily full of businesses owned by immigrant business owners, the majority from Cambodia. It's a neighborhood that has extreme disparities in income, just a few blocks apart. And this is a map that has one dot for every person, color-coded by their census-identified race or ethnicity, which shows established African-American, Irish-American, Italian-American communities, and since the 1970s, increasing numbers of residents who come as immigrants or refugees from places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and more recently, Afghanistan, Syria, and Bhutan. And so this park in this pretty densely populated neighborhood is an important and lively social hub. But it's also been a place where real social drama plays out, real issues of turf and the racialization of space. The most recent incident of which was after some shooting in the park about 3 years ago, a celebrated, if unlicensed, group of food vendors was shut down in the aftermath by the authorities. In addition, as you might imagine, for a park that was built 100 years ago and hasn't received much public investment since, there's a long list of complaints that you don't need to ask too much about to hear. From we need more places for tweens to climb on so they're not making their own play equipment. We've needed places within this generally passive park to play all kinds of sports and activities, like this DIY foot volleyball court, which works pretty well for the people who play foot volleyball, except when it kicks up big clouds of dust that float over to where these elders bring their own furniture so they can play cards. And of course, on rainy days, it's a bit of a mess. So the very first way I want to suggest that design might make dealing with power more accessible is by making policy public, coming out of a long tradition known as popular education, here represented by a woman in the middle. Anybody know her? Septa McClark. And so in this case, we were able to launch, before any design started, any planning started, a project called Park Powers, where 15 high school students were employed for 8 weeks over the summer through a summer youth employment program, working with the Philadelphia Mural Arts Restored Spaces Initiative. And they were charged by a nascent coalition of neighborhood organizations to try to answer one seemingly simple question. What does Southeast Philly have to do to get Mifflin Square Park rebuilt how it wants? So we started off with some general brainstorming. What do we know about parks? Surveying the territory, trying to mark down what we found and read out the life of the community from there. We visited the free library to understand how the neighborhood evolved around the park itself, to see how it looked differently over time. And we hit the pavement to talk to adult decision makers, asking questions of the leaders of neighborhood organizations, but also policy advocates around open space, the landscape architects inside the Parks Department. How do all these decisions get made? And every time we met someone, we would use our skills as social critics and artists to try to break down what we heard, what we believed, what we were skeptical of. And teenagers, oftentimes being much less power evasive than us older people, would zero in on things, like their perception that the Parks Department staff was differentially treating, say, Cambodian unlicensed food vendors who they said things like, well, maybe they don't know how to use a trash can, versus, say, this depiction of an unlicensed Italian grandmother selling meatballs and how she might be treated. Further, as we dug into the archive, the students were amazed to find a whole series of materials that really gave the lie to all kinds of stories we had heard blaming bad things on the most recent set of people to arrive, like things were pristine and you could eat off the sidewalk until the Vietnamese people showed up, or it was super peaceful and quiet around here until the Cambodians showed up. You know, finding an article from 1941 wherein it's Italian-American kids knifing each other up or shooting each other really, I think, showed that that was not a true narrative. And when we met the city council person, he blew everyone's mind by saying that maybe raising the $4 million to fix up the park wouldn't be the biggest stretch, but getting a minimum of 8 out of 10 residents to agree on a single idea for rebuilding the park, that would be the challenge. So we began to think about what we had learned and how to reformat it and communicate it to a broader audience, like studying the bureaucracy of the Parks Department and wondering if any kind of policy idea could make it from the upper echelons of local government with the mayor, the council, down to the physical parks we were looking at. Or trying to imagine how a coalition could grow its political power in the neighborhood, imagining what each group could offer to the coalition and receive from it. Imagining that combination as this kind of Voltron character that would ingest all of the organizations to become some kind of superhero. We got feedback from the organizations that we had learned from and made drawings like this that tried to connect individuals recorded by the census through neighborhood organizations into the Voltron character who transforms into a superhero who uses soda tax money to fix the park. Or this drawing that breaks down how the Parks Department typically rebuilds a park and the points at which a neighborhood usually has the most success in advocating for the way they want it to be. The group drew all kinds of characters that we met in the park, the good things that we saw, the things that we thought were bad, to make drawings like this one, a tribute to MC Meek Mill called Park Dreams and Nightmares, meant to spark discussions of the worst you could imagine and the best for this space. These were then shared with the decision makers and displayed in public, just looking to increase incrementally the amount of discussion about this place and what it would take to make it different. The second way I want to suggest that design can play a role in a process like this is by producing the public. From community organizers, and this is shown here as a 1972 first ever national conference of neighborhoods held in Chicago, we learned that the public is not something that just exists out there. It's something that has to be painfully assembled by knocking on doors, flyering, making email lists, Facebook groups. And so the first thing that the coalition said is we want to send something home with every school kid in this neighborhood, about 7,000 kids, that uses the graphics that were created over the summer. So this is in 8 languages. It shares some of the things that the students found, as well as offers a fleeting, if fun opportunity to project a personal vision onto the park of the future. That then opened the door to being invited into the spaces of many small organizations throughout the neighborhood to use these kinds of materials in order to talk about our dreams of open space, our memories, what we thought should be in the park, etc. Using each of these small scaled objects that would show you like how big a volleyball court is, but also these more open-ended ones to have a discussion that might not happen otherwise. You know, should there be hills in this flat park? Could the playground more reflect the cultures of the people that live here? Could there ever be a bathroom? And some of the discussions happened, and these were oftentimes between interpreters. Like this meeting was in Swahili, Karen, and English. And the most amazing confluences of identity would sometimes happen, like this gentleman who said, oh, well, a couple generations back, my family came straight from the South farming to the big city. And then this Korean woman from Burma said, who had arrived like 2 years earlier, said, that's so crazy, that's exactly what happened to me. And so in this way, identities can melt, and we're not talking about necessarily what equality is or equity as a definition. We're talking about where the volleyball court should go. And this ends then with people being able to bring together the ideas from those smaller gatherings to be able to appreciate or criticize the ideas of their neighbors. And so the final way that I'm going to suggest today that design might play a role here is finding ways to build with roots in organized communities. And so we took some of the first and most popular ideas that came out, like more places to sit, and began to try to build those right now, even before we have the $4 million that the councilman promised us. Working with a group called Public Workshop in Philadelphia, we were able to prototype and build this, which is called the super seating. And we even, working with CMAC, our primary client, were able to get a food truck that could be shared by vendors that is fully licensed. Now, most people we talked to said that after all these DIY alterations to the park, it felt too small. People were stepping on each other's toes, and it was causing conflict. And we began to think that it was kind of like when you leave your house in a hurry, kind of like I did last night, and you don't do such a good job of packing your suitcase, and not as much stuff would fit as otherwise. And so the goal became to repack the suitcase, to try to move around the things that people already did in a way that created more space overall. But this required actually talking to all these user groups, the kids, the moms, the volleyball players, the guys who always sit here on this table, to try to find a potential shared agreement about how this space could work. And then having times where these different groups could come together to argue out the pros and cons of the designs and the visions that they supported. Bringing together people who might not always talk so much in everyday life, but shared this neighborhood and needed to find a way for it to work together. So earlier this summer, we were able to release a concept plan. And now, because I told you it's before, after, and beyond, we're doing the really hard and critical work of building up the financial power, the political power to make it real, trying to make drawings that show and reflect back in this loop of feedback what this space could be and how it could look. And of course, this took many, many hands. So here's, you see some of those people. And so even though this process does not yet have a kind of clean, crisp before and after, I can't tell you exactly what the construction details will look like. I certainly hope that the look on this young woman's face is not just because she finds a drawing aesthetically appealing, but perhaps she imagines a time, maybe distantly in the future, once this space is really changed, although keeping the community around it, and someone walks by and asks her, hey, who put that there? Thank you very much.
Great job, Damon. Thank you very much. Wow, what a cool little park, huh? All right, our final speaker of the day just got in. She's here. She's here. Excellent. She's works on the issues of large-scale land use changes in the 20th century of this country, and she looks at cities and examines the social and geographic implications of structural poverty. She has a book out recently called People Before Highways, which looks at opposition in Boston to interstate and other highways, which would have torn the city apart in the 1960s. Please welcome, just in from meetings in her other capacity working for the city of Boston, Karilyn Crockett.
Go this way. Good afternoon. Hi. It is so great to be here. Fantastic conversation, I'm sure. I know that my fellow panelists have regaled you with all kinds of stories of power and might and will and potential and what we need to do and how to get it right and design and all that, and equity. Yes. So my presentation is not that. So I'm glad they got you covered. My presentation is a little bit of a rumination, and And I think hopefully a public service announcement about the need to remember, and hopefully the role that memory can play in helping us remember what equity is, what it needs to be, and what we can do about that. So I'm just going to roll up my sleeves a little bit and dive into it. So I entitled my presentation, "The Ground We Walk Upon, Progress," quote unquote. What is progress? How many times has that thing changed before us, kind of like a genie in a bottle that we don't know what to do with? And equity battles, so many of them now in our midst, in our face, and through time, the same fight over and over again. Will we get it right? Do we have the might? Do we have the will? Do we have the collective commitment to see it out? And the production of healthy cities, what are they? And I would say, what is the production of healthy cities without people, without memory, without justice? One of my favorite writers is James Cone, a theologian. And James Cone reminds us that there is no justice without memory. So welcome to Boston. Some of you are here for a little bit of time. Some of you have been here for a while. I've been here for a while. I was born here. And have definitely spent so much of my time in my career trying to understand this place that I call home. Sometimes I struggle to call home. I try to understand and try to make sense of. And so many of the gifts of stories that have gone before me and make clear what I inherit in this city have shaped my outlook and my sense of possibility. So even when things seem so challenging and sometimes I would say hopeless, I promise you that the past and so much courage of so many before us have definitely paved the way to the future. So Boston, right? So although we like to remind you over and over and over that we are a city of champions, hurrah, Red Sox, right? That we are a city on a hill, that we are the cradle of liberty and all that big talk, hurrah. A city of firsts, right? It's first school, first public school in America, first subway, first telephone, all these things. Grab any Bostonian and that person can fill in the rest of this list on cue. He can tell you all the things that we are so proud of and that we did first, I promise you. But what I want to share is what not to do, and how Boston has exemplified over and over again, sometimes to our great peril, what not to do. So a public service announcement on what not to do, and the power of memory. And what can these stories tell us about equity battles of the past and present, and what can they teach us right now and give us a sense of hopefulness even when it seems like we have anything but. So here is an image for us, maybe. Looks familiar to some of you. So once upon a time, I'll tell you a story, progress in older post-industrial cities like Boston meant destruction, devastation, and displacement, and it was legal in common. Before you is a picture of an old neighborhood called the West End. Many of you are familiar with this image because it has gained us some fame on what not to do. So the story is that essentially in 1958, we had a moment of genius, and we decided that the way to make progress was to destroy neighborhoods like this. A very vibrant mixed race neighborhood, a strong Italian community, a strong Jewish community, a sizable black community, in a part of the city that was dense, that was working class, that was poor, but decided to be ground zero for the new Boston, its future, and everything we would become. And in the process really struck a chord in the middle of the city's heart in terms of defining what is progress and for whom. If 1948 and then 49 and 58 and 59 would be the time to determine a new Boston, a new sense of progress and equity, what would that look like and whom would benefit? Well, no one who lived here was basically the conclusion. And so in the front of that slide, you see now a smear of dirt. So on April 25th, 1958, letters were sent to all the residents in this neighborhood. And by December of 1959, the neighborhood was completely demolished. 2,000 people were the remaining set of families from about 11,000 folks who lived there at its peak and were completely pushed out of the side and dispersed to the wind. And so this was progress. This was legal. This was the moment in America's history where urban renewal, dislocation was the way to make yourselves anew, a way to think about investment and the way to think about a future. So urban renewal cut gaping holes in the city's landscape and permanently displaced long-term residents who were not consulted, who were not given compensation, but were moved right through. And so this was a beginning moment of saying, what? What do you mean? What's next and what's coming? And so what would be the next set of fights ahead? This is what the people said. We still won't move. To hell with urban renewal. So just in case you were sitting there and were wondering what did residents have to say about this act of dislocation, this is what they said. They said to the mayor, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, and their sycophants. Nice, right? The committee for North Harvard Street, for 9 years, we've waited, we've been trying to meet with you, and there's nothing. We won't move. To hell with urban renewal. And so a wake-up call for, again, rethinking what the city's future would be, what the city's commitment to a type of progress that did not include the people who were living here, and what they were entitled to, not even their homes, not even their neighborhoods, not even their networks, or what they knew. And so the next question is, so then what happened? Did we learn? Did we learn from this? Well, no, then we said, you know what, we're going to make highways here. We're going to bring an interstate highway through the city because that's what the government is saying is progress. And so in 1948, the city of Boston comes up with a tremendous plan to bring a 10 to 12 lane highway right through the city's center core, or actually the edge of it. So we're looking toward the east, looking toward, if you know it as a landmark, the Prudential Tower, Back Bay. You're sliced right here through the edge of Roxbury and Jamaica Plain. There's public housing that's here. There's a road that's there. Looks kind of nice, maybe. The future always looks nice, doesn't it? Until you ask the question, for whom? To what end? So this road was meant to bring 160,000 cars through the middle of the city. It would have displaced thousands of residents, long-term residents through the core of Boston, neighborhoods of Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, Cambridge, Brookline, Somerville. All of that would have just been pushed to the side. But this time, the neighborhood residents came together slowly and steadily and said no. And in fact, they said, hell no. And so the question was, for us again, now fast forwarding not from 1959, but a little bit ahead to 1969, what is our future? Who is engaged in it? Who is deciding what progress is? And what do we remember about what happened before? And what happened before this was the West End. So when we look at this map of the highway, the question sort of came back to people. If this is what we're imagining to be Boston's economic future, its social future, who is coming into the city? At this moment, this is a rendering from around what the 1965 map would have looked like. So you can see this highway represented by the dotted lines. We're going to take us north, connecting up through some suburbs to New Hampshire, coming down, taking us through some southern suburbs and through the southwest, and taking us down to Rhode Island. This would put Massachusetts right in the middle of sort of this northern break in Interstate 95. What's interesting about the story is that this time around, the residents really mobilized, got together and said no, said hell no. We didn't believe you before, and we don't believe you now. And so the conversation point for me is then, what does that look like? What does it mean for people to really take action, to come together, and to protest what they think is an unsustainable, unjust future? And that's exactly what happened. This is an archival image from January 25th, 1969, when this coalition that had been bubbling up slowly, that had already remembered and relived and lived through the devastation of the West End, would come together and see the threat of a highway in their face and say, not this time. And so you can see what is an incredible array of folks from the suburbs, from the city, from working class communities to affluent communities, to ladies who lunch, to ladies who smoke, to children who are coming out, to Cambridge intellectuals really raising the question. And in this moment of like intense consciousness and mobilization, where folks were already activated by the civil rights movement, by the anti-war movement, the student protests, raising questions about planning, raising questions about roads, about their future, and what the city's sustainability should be and could be. And so that's our moment. And then you say, well, you know, okay, we sort of figured it out. We figured out that progress, the progress that was being sold by the governor of Massachusetts at the time, by many city officials, by intellectuals even, was bankrupt. Residents really taking into their own hands what it would mean to redefine the future, to think about not just road building, but mobility more generally. How do you get around? Where do you live? The city dealing with an affordability crisis at this very moment. And you say, okay, so that's great. That's the past. Boston has all this incredible cultural capital and social capital now. We have all these great schools, and it's wonderful. We celebrate the region. Well, we have these great schools perhaps, but what if you were trying to go to school before now? What if you were trying to go to school in, say, 1975, and you were in high school, and you were trying to go to school at South Boston High, and this was the day that you were leaving school to go home? And not only were you happy that school was over, but the security and the safety around your school was such that they had to back the school buses up to the front door of the school because the safety and the violence of you just pursuing your right to education was such that you had to walk directly out of the front door of the school into your school bus waiting for you. So many of us know this story, this narrative of school desegregation, which is just an example of Bostonians trying to get better education for their children by court order. The Boston desegregation case is notable because it is an example of again, citizens coming together and demanding a very different kind of future. The question I raise is it necessary for that to be by court order? Every time when we think about an alternative future, is it necessary for citizens to marshal the political will themselves directly to bring equality to the city or cities? The school desegregation case in Boston is notable because it was the result of a petition filed by 43 black parents who sued the Boston School Committee to integrate. Many of us know how that story wound up. Very, very contentious and violent, but the question remains, or the issue remains, that the quality of education in the city of Boston is always and will always be front and center, I would say, even though unresolved, because of what parents and their children did to try to raise the bar and raise the conversation for what just an equitable education could look like in the city. So, okay, we learned that lesson, did we? We're still learning it, but the memory of these residents and their commitment to justice is clear and stays with us. So what else? What else can we say about the city? What else can we say about Boston? Oh, well, we like the water here, right? The water is beautiful. This is the water side at the Charles River. Some of you may be sailors, swimmers. The water is beautiful. We like it. Well, that's how it looks. It looks very pleasant. You wouldn't complain about that. You wouldn't have a problem until unless you remember that it looked like that. That is what the Boston Harbor looked like not long ago, barely a generation ago, and led none other than George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988 to call it the dirtiest harbor in America, though he was embittered and upset because Michael Dukakis had the audacity, right, to run against him for president as a Democratic nominee. But the conversation about the cleanup of the harbor was front and center, national news, and what happened here? Nothing. Nothing until, again, residents themselves took it upon themselves to sue the city, sue the state, and led to a federal court order to clean up the Boston Harbor, which for us winds up being now a national story, a story of one of the nation's biggest environmental victories, $3.8 billion invested in the cleanup of Boston Harbor. So what is the story here? The story is all of these moments of intervention when what was taken to be the true kind of high water mark of progress, of equity, was dismantled, redefined, and totally challenged by citizen actions and their commitment to intervening and saying no. And thank goodness, whether it is fights around good education, a more livable urban space, walkability, mass transit, clean water for recreation or what have you, we owe an incredible debt to the folks here and in other places that have taken to the streets to command something different. And so my question remains, what political will, what is our commitment to letting not only the memory of the past and what has happened guide us, but let that lesson of citizen action and mobility tell our story? And so here is a collection of folks that really were responsible for delivering on these stories for us. But unfortunately here, like in so many cities, we actually don't know our own stories. We don't have memories of the victories, of the lessons of the previous generation. Many of these folks here, this is from that first day of the sort of anti-highway fight in the 60s, people showing up to protest on the State House steps, and many of the people who were organizing as architects, actually as radical planners. They're featured here. I see Fred Salvucci, who would go on to be State Transportation Secretary for Massachusetts, here in the middle. He's notable because he was a radical planner, an organizer who remembered the story of his grandmother and her being displaced by expansion of the Mass Turnpike and how terrible the experience was for him and his family and for his grandmother. He would take that into the government bureaucracy and become the state transportation planner and use the power of the memory and the justice that was not exacted to his grandmother to change state policy. And many of these people here, I see they're like a hall of fame because they help us remember what we need to remember and what happened and what our values can be and should be. And again, so the question for me largely is around how do you get those stories shared? How do we take the memories of fights against power, of fights against pure political visions that are not inclusive, that are not sustainable, that are not equitable, and make sure that the stories of one generation can be passed to the next? So for about the past 20 years, I've been working with young people to think about different kinds of projects to share stories of the past, not only for the sake of putting things in a jar, but to use these stories as tactical playbooks for action, for information and consciousness raising. This is a project this project was working with 4 young people, high school students in Jamaica Plain, in a neighborhood that is under intense pressure for gentrification and displacement. And I had them talk to their family members and their neighbors about what the neighborhood was like and how they were successful in stopping a highway. Some folks were in the way of what would have been the road, that highway expansion project, how they had been able to hold ground. And you can see them using photographs and meeting with each other and meeting with family members to kind of verify stories, to talk, to create timelines, to create presentations which they then took out to the neighborhood. and then taking those stories to the street. So through these kinds of projects, allowing young people to be sort of empowered around not just what happened, but empowered to be in charge of educating people around the city and even visitors to the city. So through this work, we were able to create an alternative kind of tourism model, which takes a really deep dive into political organizing, strategizing, really thinking about transferring of tactics of political possibilities that have already been lived through, real examples of what we know what works. We can blue sky all day about kind of what should happen, but it's incredible to imagine what has already happened as giving us incredible fodder for imagining the future, and how to activate communities locally across generations to take ownership of these stories and to make sure that there's a way to keep them in circulation. So one of the challenges before us in terms of thinking through equitable cities and sustainable cities is how can we make the transmission of our stories and our tactics more sustainable, more fluid, and more accessible. And so this is our moment, and I will leave it here on this very slightly depressing slide. This is kind of the end of my public service announcement, but it's asking us to look at what are the issues right here and now. This may be true for where you're coming from, but this is a snapshot of Boston. We are in the middle of an incredibly powerful construction boom. The city is growing. We are a city of about 640,000 people. We have about $14 or $15 billion in construction happening right now. By some accounts, it could be the third largest construction boom in the city's 400-year history. Lots of people are engaged. Lots of people want to come here and go to work here and bring their businesses here. But at the same time, we have an incredible economic equity gap, interracial gap. We know the Color of Wealth report was put out by the Federal Reserve Bank a couple years ago and reminded us that for every $1 of liquid assets for a white family, you have 2 cents for a black family versus 14 cents for a Caribbean family versus less than 1 cent on the dollar for a Puerto Rican and Dominican family. And so just that snapshot alone, you get a sense of what we're not doing, what we're not getting right. Despite all of the opportunity that's here, we have not connected the dots. We look at this number that's also from the Federal Reserve that lets us see that we have $247,000 in wealth that's held by a white family versus $8 for a black or African American family. That is not a typo. That is the data that is letting us know the racial wealth gap story, that's letting us know about the work that we have to do. We've earned the unenviable distinction a couple years ago from the Brookings Institution of having the highest rate of income inequality in the country. And so as I sit and look at this incredible list of challenges and issues, the question remains for me, what can we learn about what this moment is telling us progress is? Is progress more of this? Is this the direction? Or what can we take from the past, from the generation before us that's fought similar battles to tell us that there's got to be a different direction, and there's got to be more people engaged, and they got to be younger than the folks who are typically in these rooms. So I will stop there with my public service announcement, and thank you for your attention.